Welcome to the Demand for Money on NyQuil. This is part 2 of a 3-part lecture course thing that I am making for, well, you guessed it, the demand for money. And you also guessed it, on NyQuil. So last time we met, we went over the quantity theory of money, which we saw was a pretty interesting theory. It had some interesting qualities to it, some interesting predictions that are used by the academic community. Is the theory is taken seriously, but it does have some problems. And a big one was that the demand for money, or the velocity of money, right, the speed at which money was changing hands, was stable, thus it was predictable. The idea was that you would finance money, or you would hold money to finance transactions, and the money that you'd want to hold would be proportional to what you want to buy. But we looked at the data and we could see it didn't really conform all that well with the data. So we have to have a different theory, right? There has to be a different approach that we can use to understand how money demand works. So what we are going to do is we are going to be using what's known as the liquidity preference theory of money demand. And the idea here is that money is competing with other assets as a store of value. Money is more liquid than other assets, thus it can be used in exchange. But the drawback, right, because this is economics, there's always going to be some kind of a trade-off. You get something really good, but you got to give up something else in order to get this really good thing, right? In this case, you get a liquid asset, the most possibly liquid asset you could possibly get, helps facilitate exchange. But the issue is it's not going to be generating any kind of a positive real return, right? Money's actually losing value. If you just decide to hold a bunch of money, you want to put it in like a glass jar and stash it under the bed because you haven't trusted the bank since, the crash of 29, then you're just going to be losing out, right? Money itself, it holds value in the short run, but in the long run, inflation eats away at its purchasing power. So money isn't earning a positive real return. But another asset, like a bond, for example, does earn a positive real return. So why wouldn't you want to hold a few bonds, right? You want to hold some bonds, you want to hold a little bit of money. You don't want to totally hold bonds because then you're not liquid at all. But you don't want to hold all money either because then you're losing out on some kind of a positive real return over time. So for the liquidity preference of money, we will be assuming that the demand for real money balances, M over P, is an increasing function of output. Why? Or really, it needs to be an increasing function of income, but output and income, same thing here. So it's an increasing function of your income. It's a decreasing function of the nominal interest rate, R. And it's given by this right here. M over P is equal to a function of income and the nominal interest rate. Now, if we were to compare that to money velocity, this is what we would get. So they're a little different from each other. And because these functional forms are a little different, the predictions provided by these different functional forms will be, well, you guessed it, different. So let's talk for a minute about what you might remember from microeconomics, or what you may not microeconomics. However, because I am recording this lecture and you are watching it on your own time, if you remember or don't remember, it's not a big deal. You don't have to worry about anything. No one's there to shame you if you don't remember, and no one's there to be like, you nerd, if you do remember. But, someone calls you a nerd for remembering, oh well, I think it's kind of cool. So let's talk about microeconomic theory and talk about the demand curves for like stuff. Now, maybe you remember, maybe you don't, that demand is derived from a utility maximization problem. The agent's maximizing their utility subject to a budget constraint. So if you remember, there's a representative agent in the economy, they've got some utility function, and they've got a budget constraint. And we do a constrained optimization problem, and in doing so, we will get the demand for the goods that are in their utility function. So if you've got utility of good 1 and good 2, you will get a demand curve for good 1 and a demand curve for good 2. right? The idea, if we're abstracting away from the mathematics and we're just going to kind of go with the intuition, the idea would be that you want to get the most that you can given how much you earn each month, right? You want to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. And the demand curve is going to be downward sloping in prices, meaning that price and quantity are inversely related, right? It's going to be giving us that downward sloping demand curve. It's a function of price, quantity, and income. And there are two effects to a price change. There's a substitution effect, which is always negative. And with a substitution effect, if the price goes up, the quantity demanded decreases. And then there's an income effect. And with the income effect, what happens is you get a change in purchasing power resulting from this price change, because the change in the price of one good is going to lead to a change in relative prices. And if there's a change in relative prices, that leads to a change in real purchasing power. Sometimes this effect is positive, sometimes this effect is negative. And we get a very, very special case that's actually very interesting, where the income effect is positive and its magnitude is larger than that of the substitution effect. And that's how you get an upward sloping demand curve. You can learn all about Giffen goods and the Irish potato famine some other time, but it is a pretty interesting topic. So let's say we want to look at the demand for NyQuil chicken. Well, if we want that, well, this is what we would get. We'd get the price on the vertical axis, the quantity on the horizontal axis, and there would be some downward sloping demand curve, this nice inverse relationship between price and quantity. By the way, don't try this at home, kids. NyQuil chicken, bad for your health. The demand for money. Let's look at the money demand. Well, it's kind of the same idea. You get the price of money on the vertical axis, and you get the quantity of money on the horizontal, and you get a nice downward sloping demand. So there's this inverse relationship between the nominal interest rate and money. So money demand really isn't all that different from the demand for, like, say, NyQuil chicken, right? Because we still have a good. In this case, it's money. There's a price, and there's a downward sloping money demand curve. We even actually derive it the same way. It's still a utility maximization problem. So what's the price of money? Well, kind of already gave that away. But bear with me. Let's go down this rabbit hole together for a second. Let's say you want to hold on to some cash. All right, well, what are you giving up by holding on to this cash, right? Are you giving up buying things today? If you know, your friends are like, hey, we're going to go downtown and party and, drink a lot of chocolate milk. Do you want to come drink a lot of chocolate milk with us? And you're like, well, I would love to. Chocolate milk is fantastic, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on my spending. I'm going to hold some money instead of spending it. Well, you're giving up buying things like, hangover, but in doing so, you're holding on to the money, right? It's the trade-off. If you can either have the money or you can spend the money, but you don't get your cake and eat it too. But what else are you giving up here? Let's say that you've got $1,000 in hand right now. What are you giving up by holding on to that $1,000, right? If you hold on to it, obviously you can't lend it. You have to either hold it or you lend it. But let's say you did lend out your money, right? And it got paid back in a couple of months. Well, you'd be getting more than what you lent out. Why is this? Well, you'd have to be compensated for parting ways with your money. If someone's like, I want to borrow your money and I'll pay it all back in, a couple of months, you're going to be like, that's fine. I don't mind necessarily, but what's in it for me, right? You got to give me something that's going to induce me to lend my money to you. Well, in that case, you would need interest. You'd want to earn interest on that money. But if you hold that money, you don't earn any interest. So the interest is what you're giving up by holding on to that money. The interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding idle cash. It's the value of the next best option, so to speak. Right? So the interest rate is the price of money. Note that this is the nominal interest rate, not the real interest rate. So the nominal interest rate, like if you go and take out a loan and they say, okay, cool, the interest rate's 5%, right? The interest rate that they quote to you is the nominal interest rate. And the nominal interest rate is the price of money. Now, we're going to be going over two, it says simple. Simple is kind of a relative term here. We're going to be covering two different models. There's the Baumol Tobin model, which covers intra-temporal portfolio allocation. The idea is that given some amount of desired spending, how much do you allocate your wealth between money and bonds? Then there's the money in the utility function model. Now, this is why I'm like, this one's not super, super simple. But it is interesting. And again, trade-offs, right? You kind of lose a little bit of simplicity, but you gain a lot in explanatory and predictive power of a model. With the money in the utility function model, the idea is that we now have an intertemporal problem with a consumption savings decision and a portfolio allocation problem. It's derived using a general equilibrium framework, and this is what makes it get a little bit tricky in advance. We won't be doing the general equilibrium stuff here right now, but we will kind of dip our toes in it a little bit in the future. Both of these models, right, Model 1 and Model 2 here, will generate a money demand function that looks like this, right? It's going to be a function of the nominal interest rate and incomes. So let's start with the Baumol Tobin model. The idea is that you need to spend your income Y over the course of a period. The idea is also that you have sufficient wealth to do this. The average holdings of illiquid wealth earn a nominal return of R. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically your bond holdings are going to earn a nominal interest rate of R. And you need to decide how much money you want to hold, and the money earns nothing, but it allows you to support transactions, right? You can fund your transactions with money, and you can withdraw the money as often as you'd like, but each withdrawal does incur what's known as a shoe leather cost of K, which is greater than or equal to 0. The idea is every time you have to go to the ATM to withdraw your money, it takes time, it takes effort, and it wears away the bottom of your shoes. The amount that it's wearing away the bottom of your shoes is what's known as the shoe leather cost. So let's just say, right, because it's done just within one period, and you can withdraw the funds whenever you would like within that period, but each time you go, you incur a cost. So let's say you want to pull all of the funds that you need at the beginning of a period. So you make just one trip to the bank. Well, your average real balance holdings over the period are going to be Y over 2. You would be foregoing R times Y over 2 in interest holding money instead of bonds. Right? So essentially, by taking out everything at once, you're not allowing for bonds to gain any interest because you're literally just holding all of it in money instead. And you're going to incur a shoe leather cost of just K. So the total cost here would be K plus R times Y over 2. So the total cost as a function of trips to the bank, which is capital T, is going to be this right here. So total cost is equal to T times K plus R times Y over 2T. So if T is equal to 1, you just get K plus RY over 2. And we have an average of real balance holdings being equal to M equals Y over 2T. So we can rewrite total cost in terms of M instead of T. So the total cost is now in terms of real money balances instead of trips. And we get this, KY over 2M plus R times M. Now, if we want to get the demand function, right, we have to take the first derivative and we need to set it equal to 0. Why do we do that? Well, when we take the derivative of a function, right, it's giving us the rate of change. It's giving us the slope. So if we take the derivative of a function and set it equal to 0, what's happening is we are getting the derivative and we're setting it equal to when the slope is 0. Let's think about this for a second. What happens to a function when its slope is 0? Think about it for a second. All right, maybe draw out like a parabola, and think about when the slope is 0, right? When the slope is 0, it's a flat line. So when you have a flat line as a tangent point of a function, that's either going to be the maximum or it's going to be the minimum. In this case, it's the maximum, right? So we are we're minimizing here because it's cost. So we're minimizing this total cost function, and in order to minimize that, we take the derivative and set it equal to 0. Right? So we are minimizing our costs, and then we're solving for m. So we're getting the derivative of the total cost with respect to m. All right, we differentiate that. We get k, or negative ky times 2m to the negative 2 plus r equals 0. We move r to the other side. Gives me this guy right here. We divide both sides by r, multiply both sides by 2m squared. Gives me this, after a little bit of algebra that you're not going to need to do. We get this guy right here. M equals ky over 2 to the 1/2 times r to the 1/2. Demand for real money balances is increasing in y and decreasing in r, just like I said it would be at the beginning of this lecture. So when we look at this, right, this right here, equation 8, is the money demand function using the Baumol Tobin model. But let's take another step, right? We're going to wrap up the Baumol Tobin model here, and we're going to jump into the money and the utility function model. And then what we can do is we can look at the two different functions and go, okay, I can see what's going on here, right? I can see both of them are giving me at least similar functions in terms of what m is increasing in and what it is decreasing in. So let's go to the money and the utility function model. Now, this setup is a bit more complicated, so you're going to have to stick with me on this. It's going to be strange, but honestly, the more you see this, the easier it's going to get. Now, this is part of what's known as dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, or DSGE. DSGEs are pretty much the gold standard in macroeconomic research in academia. DSGE models are essentially the backbone of all, I'd say useful macroeconomic models, especially in business cycle macro. And the idea is essentially that you've got multiple markets, so multiple equations that are simultaneous. And so with this system of equations that you have to describe your market, right, to describe your overall economy, we can then go, all right, I've got demand, I've got supply, I've got money demand, money supply, I've got the demand for bonds, I've got the supply of bonds. And then we can look at how, say, monetary policy changes affect the whole economy. And we do so in a way that's actually taking advantage of a particular endogeneity problem, which then lets us take data to it in a very simple and easy to model way. And as a result, we get a really nice, simple, yet complete picture of the macroeconomy. It's a very, very useful tool. Anyways, I know I got a little carried away there, but these models can get very advanced. Namely, the stochastic part makes it very, very, very advanced. Don't worry, as we look at some DSGE stuff, it's really going to be more like DGE because the stochastic component isn't really going to be a big deal. I'm not even going to touch on it in this course because when we get to when you get to a point where you're playing with DSGE models, you could honestly take an entire course just on solving DSGE models because of the stochastics. It's very, very, very complicated, very advanced, and I don't want to waste your time doing like a ton of math. So enough of that. Finally, I promise. Let's talk about what we're going to assume here. We assume there's a household that's representative of the population. It's what's known as a representative agent. It's a little strange, but we're basically assuming there's one household in the economy. Now, the household can hold money or bonds, and money loses value at a rate of pi t per period, and bonds pay a real return of lowercase rt per period. if you buy bonds today, the bond gets repaid tomorrow. So it's a one-period bond. The bond gets repaid tomorrow plus some interest, so you can consume more tomorrow. So it's kind of like a penny saved is a penny earned, but like a penny saved is 1.5 a penny earned, assuming you've got, a really nice rate of interest there. Now, the household gets utility from consuming goods, which is C, and holding real money balances, which is MOB, which is lowercase m. The utility function is this. It's the natural log of consumption plus phi times the natural log of money. I'm going to get a little bit more into this later, but essentially the household wants to maximize utility subject to a budget constraint of this guy right here. You're probably like, oh my God, what the hell was I thinking taking this course? Well, slow down. It's not too bad just yet. Let's take a look at this. The right-hand side of equation 10 is consumption, money balances, bonds, and transfers net of taxes. The right-hand side is output, which is income, plus 1 plus the inflation rate times tomorrow's real money balances, plus 1 over 1 plus the real interest rate of tomorrow's bond holdings. Now, money and bonds are state variables. What that means is if you are to get more money, right, you want to increase your holdings of real money balances, or you want to buy more bonds, you don't buy bonds today or decide to hold money from today. So this BT and MT, right, isn't part of what you're deciding today. Instead, what you're deciding is MT plus 1 and BT plus 1. And it'll pay off tomorrow, or in the case of MT plus 1, fail to pay off tomorrow because, it's losing value. So what we've got really is a source of funds on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, we have a use of funds. Now, both B and M have stores of value, right? Bonds have store of value, right? Because it's an asset that is worth something that will pay off tomorrow. M has a store of value, but it does lose a little bit of its value, pi t. If it lost all of its value, you wouldn't want to hold it. It wouldn't really be very good money anymore, right? So the difference here between money and bonds is that bonds pay interest and money loses value over time. Now, the representative household is assumed to live for an infinite number of periods, and they discount their future utility by beta to the power of t each period. So the problem is dynamic, while the Baumol Tobin model was not dynamic. And when it comes to this discounting and all that, don't worry, you're actually going to get more than sufficient training on discounting and dynamics and all of that within the next couple of weeks. So the problem here is dynamic in the sense of how much do we want to consume today versus how much do we want to consume in the future. But there's also a portfolio allocation problem, which is how much do I want to save in money, which isn't generating any interest, versus bonds, which are generating interest. So I got to do a little bit of magic here, and then I got to do a little bit of calculus to get two functions. I need the Euler equation, which is going to help me get the Fisher relationship, and then I need a portfolio allocation function. And with these two, I can then derive a money demand curve. So in doing so, right, I did all the calculus for you here. You don't need to do the calculus on this yet. I get this, which is the Euler equation. And then I get this, which is the portfolio allocation equation. And I combine them to get this right here. Now, I'm sure you're probably cursing me again because you're like, wow, there's 3 really strange looking equations here. And there aren't really any numbers with the exception of 1. So I'll explain equation 11 first. Then I'll explain 12 a little bit, although 12 is somewhat less intuitive than 11. And then 13 will hopefully fall into place from me explaining 11 and 12. So we'll start with 11. This is what's known as the Euler equation. This is the flow of consumption over time. So I've got 1 over C, which is the marginal utility of consumption. And that's equal to beta times 1 over CT plus 1. That's the marginal utility of tomorrow's consumption. But that is also being weighted by 1 plus R, which is 1 plus the nominal interest rate, right? We can think of this as a flow of consumption. It's a consumption path over time where my decision to either consume today or consume tomorrow is determined by beta, which is my time preference, and 1 plus R, which describes the state of the market. If the interest rate, that R, exceeds beta, which is my time preference, then I prefer to consume more today. I prefer to consume more tomorrow and save more today, right? I want to consume less today and more tomorrow because it's profitable for me to do so. It pays off because, well, I get a higher rate of return. If beta, on the other hand, my time preference outweighs the interest rate, then what happens is I'd rather consume more today and less tomorrow, right? I'm not as concerned about the future. So equation 11 describes really think of it as like saving for retirement, right? Are you particularly concerned about saving for retirement, or is that a future you problem? Equation 12, let's look at this guy here. Now this one's a little strange, but it's kind of the same idea. It's just now we're doing it in terms of real money balances. So when we combine them, right, we get a flow for consumption. Think of it like, your preferences of consuming over time. And then we kind of get something sort of similar-ish for money. We put them together, then we're getting like kind of a flow of money based on our consumption patterns and an interest rate, which we can also think of it as our demand for money being a function of consumption currently and an interest rate. So money demand is a function of an interest rate and then consumption, but we can use a little bit of math and some logic here to switch that consumption term into something that's a little bit more like what we're used to seeing, namely income. How do we do this? Well, we got to talk about the government for a minute. I know. Nobody really likes talking about the government. But the government sets the money supply, they set taxes, and they issue bonds. They do no spending, right? So this tau T, transfers net of taxes, is equal to the flow of money, right? They create money. So there's the creation of new money, 1 plus pi mt plus 1, right? Minus the money that is currently in existence, mt. So it's the flow of money creation, and we add that to the flow of bond creation. So with bonds, where we want to buy bonds, we earn interest on it over time. The government sells bonds, which means they have to pay interest on it over time. So they finance their expenses with taxes, right? That transfers net of taxes thing, tau T. What we're seeing here is taxes have to be equal to money creation plus bond creation. So new debt issuance and printing money. We make some assumptions on market clearing. Why? Because this is a general equilibrium model. When there's equilibrium, we are assuming markets are clearing. So with these assumptions, we are assuming the household holds all the debt and the money is issued by the government. So in equilibrium, what we get, right, everything kind of reduces down in that constraint from, let's go back to it for a second here. Everything in the constraint in equation 10 here, everything reduces down to y equals c. Output or income equals consumption. So in equilibrium, income is equal to consumption. Now, if we make use of these market clearing assumptions and we combine those two first order conditions that we get this right here. M equals phi times Y times 1 plus R over R. So the demand for real money balances is increasing in income, increasing in phi, which is quote unquote the usefulness of money, according to Milton Friedman. We'll be talking a lot more about Milton Friedman in the next lecture, as well as through the remainder of this course, because he really is one of the greatest economists to have ever lived. Enough about that. So demand for real money balances, to recap, increasing in income, increasing in the usefulness of money. The more useful money gets, right, the more you're going to want it. And is decreasing in the nominal interest rate, which is the cost of holding money. So now that we've covered that, right, we've covered two different models where we get two somewhat similar looking demand functions, although one is intratemporal, the other is intertemporal, right? The equation 15 is intertemporal. And if you go back to the Baumol Tobin, right, one, there's no T subscript. So that should generally tell you it is intratemporal rather than intertemporal. Enough about that for now. We're going to get to a special case known as the zero lower bound. What is the zero lower bound? Well, let's talk about it. Suppose a central bank sets a very low interest rate. Like really, really low. How low can they go? Ask Ludacris, he'll probably tell you. Well, they can't go below zero. It's what's known as the zero lower bound. Now, we've hit the zero lower bound twice in the last 15 years. Once in 2008 and again in 2020. And according to the money demand function derived from the money and the utility function model, we have to have a positive rate of interest, a positive nominal rate of interest in order to have non-negative real money balances, right? Because negative real money balances make like 0 cents. So if we want real money balances that make sense, right? If we want to have a set of solutions to a system of equations that actually makes like economic sense, we have to have a positive or just a non-negative nominal rate of interest, right? It can be equal to 0, sort of, but it can't go below 0. So what happens is, as the nominal rate of interest approaches 0, the demand for real money balances goes to infinity. It becomes infinite, right? Let's look at it this way. Let's say we look at this money demand function. Let's say where it gets flat here. Let's say that's the effective lower bound. I know we got 0 down here, but just bear with me for a minute. Pretend that's not 0, right? Just ignore that. Assume 0 is here. As this gets closer and closer to 0, right, you want more and more money. So as the price gets closer to 0, you're going to demand more and more money. Thus, as the nominal interest rate approaches 0, the price of money goes to 0. The demand for it is going to go to infinity. Kind of makes sense, right? The price of something is 0. What the hell? Why not have as much of it as you can possibly get? So we'll be getting more into the zero lower bound, because it is actually a really, really fascinating subject that is probably going to get at least 2 or 3 lectures on its own. But this is going to wrap up part 2 of the money demand talk. There's one more lecture on this particular topic where we talk about Friedman's rule on the optimal quantity of money and how this ties in with the models that we've looked at so far. And then maybe we'll look at an application or two beyond just the zero lower bound. But for now, that's going to wrap it up. So thank you for sitting through this lecture. I wish I could say thanks for attending my TED Talk, but this is not a TED Talk. This is just a YouTube talk. So thank you for attending my YouTube talk.